My parents divorced when I was 8, and while it wasn't easy, they handled it well. I spent weekdays with my mom in Portland and weekends with my dad in a quieter suburb nearby. They were always civil, and I never doubted their love for me, even though I wished they were still together. When I was 10, my dad told me he was dating someone new, a woman named Diane. He seemed happy in a way I hadn't seen in years, so I was cautiously optimistic. Diane had 2 kids, Tyler and Ethan, who were a few years older than me. They were loud and demanding, always the center of attention whenever I visited. I wasn't sure how to fit in with them, so I stayed quiet most of the time. Diane, on the other hand, seemed fine at first. She was overly cheerful, always asking me about school or if I wanted snacks. It felt a bit forced, but I figured she was just trying to make a good impression. After about a year of dating, my dad told me they were getting married. He looked so excited when he said it that I didn't have the heart to tell him I wasn't thrilled. The wedding was a big outdoor affair, and even my mom came to show support. I tried to convince myself this was the start of a new, bigger family, but the truth hit me a few months later. One weekend, Dad had to run an errand, leaving Diane and me alone in the house. She called me into the kitchen and told me we needed to set some ground rules. I still remember her exact words. "I don't dislike you, but I don't like you either. You remind me too much of your mom, and that's not easy for me. So let's just agree to stay out of each other's way, okay?" I didn't know what to say. I stood there, stunned, as she calmly went back to cutting vegetables like she hadn't just shattered my trust. From that day on, everything changed. Diane was perfectly pleasant when Dad was around, but the moment he left, her attitude shifted. She'd ignore me, make sarcastic comments about my clothes or hair, and once even told me that I was lucky my dad still wanted to see me after the divorce. Tyler and Ethan took their cues from her, teasing me relentlessly. They called me charity case and made jokes about how Dad only kept me around out of guilt. When I finally broke down and told my mom about it, she was furious. She called my dad immediately and told him everything I'd said. But when I went back to his house the following weekend, Diane acted like nothing had happened. She even made cookies and offered me one, smiling like we were best friends. Later, when Dad left the room, she leaned over and whispered, "You shouldn't have told your mom. Next time, keep your mouth shut or you'll regret it." I was only 11, and I didn't know how to handle it. I was scared of what she might do if I didn't listen, so I kept quiet. From then on, I avoided her as much as I could, but it wasn't easy. She found little ways to make me feel unwelcome, like forgetting to set a place for me at dinner or making plans for the family without including me. Dad never seemed to notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. I told myself it was temporary, that I just had to make it to 18, and then I'd never have to deal with Diane or her sons again. One of the worst nights came when I was 13. Dad had invited some of his friends over for dinner, and Diane was in charge of cooking. She made a big show of asking everyone what they wanted and went out of her way to make Tyler and Ethan's favorite dishes. When it came to me, she smirked and said, "You'll eat whatever's left, won't you? That's what you're used to, isn't it?" Her friends laughed like it was a joke, but I knew better. Later that night, as I was cleaning up the dishes, a chore she always assigned to me, one of her friends pulled me aside. "You're lucky to have someone like Diane in your life," she said. "Not everyone would take on another woman's kid like this. You should be more grateful." I didn't say anything, but inside, I was burning with anger. Grateful? For what? For being treated like an outsider in my own father's house? For being reminded every weekend that I didn't belong? When I went to bed that night, I could hear Diane and her friends laughing downstairs. One of them asked, "How do you put up with him?" Diane replied, "I don't. I just remind myself he'll be gone in a few years, and then it'll just be me, Tyler, Ethan, and Rob. Rob, my dad. Not us. Not our family. Just her and her kids." That was when I realized she didn't see me as part of the family at all. I was just an obstacle in her way. By the time I was 14, I had stopped expecting anything good to come from my weekends at Dad's house. I'd perfected the art of staying out of the way, reading in my room, going for long walks around the neighborhood, and keeping interactions with Diane and her sons to a minimum. Dad noticed I seemed distant, but I always played it off as school stress or just being tired. I didn't want to tell him the truth anymore. Every time I tried in the past, he'd brush it off or make excuses for Diane. "She's under a lot of pressure," he'd say, or, "I'm sure you're just misreading things." One Friday night, Dad told me he had a surprise for me. He'd booked a family trip to California, a week at the beach. He was so excited, and I could tell he thought it was a chance for us to bond. I wanted to say no, but my mom encouraged me to go. "It might not be as bad as you think," she said. I wasn't so sure, but I agreed, hoping maybe things would be different with the change of scenery. It wasn't. Diane was sweet as pie to me in front of Dad, asking if I was excited and making a big show of including me in the plans. But as soon as he left the room, her tone changed. "Don't think this trip is about you," she said one night while we were packing. "This is for my family, not yours. Try not to ruin it." The trip started off predictably. Diane and her sons took the best rooms in the rental house, leaving me with a tiny, windowless space that barely fit a bed. Tyler and Ethan hogged the TV, the snacks, and the bathroom, and Diane acted like she didn't notice. When I asked Dad if we could go for a walk on the beach, just the two of us, Diane overheard and immediately insisted the whole family should go. I ended up walking alone at the back of the group while Dad stayed up front with her. Things came to a head on the third day of the trip. We were at the pool, and Diane started making little comments about my weight. "You should be careful with all those sodas," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Teenagers put on weight so easily." Tyler and Ethan joined in, laughing and calling me chubby and tank. I tried to ignore them, but it was too much. I snapped and said, "At least I'm not sitting here like a lump." "When's the last time either of you did anything besides eat and play video games?" Tyler's face turned red, and Ethan started yelling at me. Diane acted outraged and told me to apologize to her boys. When I refused, she marched off to find Dad. By the time she dragged him back to the pool, she was crying, saying I'd been rude and disrespectful all week. "I've tried so hard to make this trip special," she sobbed, "and he just keeps ruining everything." Dad pulled me aside and asked if it was true. I told him what had really happened, how they'd been making fun of me and how Diane had been passive-aggressively picking at me since the trip began. But instead of listening, he sighed and said, "Can't you just try to get along? She's under a lot of stress, and this trip was supposed to bring us together." I couldn't believe it. He wasn't even angry with her or the boys, just me. He made me apologize, and Diane put on this big, fake show of forgiving me, saying she just wanted us to start fresh. I could see the smirk on her face when Dad wasn't looking. She'd won again. When we got home, I told my mom everything. This time, she was done playing nice. She called Dad and told him that if Diane ever made another comment about my weight or appearance, she'd report them to Child Protective Services. Dad tried to defend Diane, but Mom shut him down, saying, "If you can't protect your son, I will." For a while, things got quieter. Diane stopped making direct comments about me, probably out of fear of what my mom might do. But the tension in the house was worse than ever. Diane ignored me unless Dad was around, and Tyler and Ethan followed her lead. I told myself it was better this way. At least they weren't actively tormenting me, but it still hurt to be treated like I didn't exist. By the time I was 16, I barely spent any time with Dad. I stayed home with my mom as much as I could, using homework and extracurricular activities as excuses. Every time I skipped a weekend, Dad called, sounding disappointed but never pressing too hard. Maybe, on some level, he knew something wasn't right. Or maybe he just didn't want to deal with it. Either way, I'd stopped expecting him to take my side. When I turned 18, I thought things would finally get easier. I was legally an adult, and I could decide how much time I spent at my dad's house, or if I wanted to go there at all. I started college a couple of hours away from Portland, which gave me the perfect excuse to avoid weekend visits. My dad seemed sad about it, but he didn't push. Diane, on the other hand, barely noticed. If anything, she seemed relieved to have me out of the picture. Even though I didn't see them much, I couldn't escape the lingering resentment. On the rare occasions I visited, Diane made sure I felt like an outsider. She wouldn't plan meals for me, would leave me out of family outings, and once, she even locked the guest bathroom door and told me to wait while everyone else used the main one. It was small, petty stuff, but it added up. Tyler and Ethan, now in their early 20s, were just as bad. They treated me like I didn't exist, except when they wanted to gloat about their newest gadgets or vacation plans. By the time I was 21, I'd stopped visiting altogether. Dad would occasionally call or send a text, but I kept my replies short and polite. It wasn't that I didn't care about him. I did. But it was clear he had no intention of standing up for me. I wasn't going to put myself back in that environment just to make him feel better. One day, out of the blue, he called and said he wanted me to come over for dinner. He sounded nervous, almost desperate, which caught me off guard. "It's important," he said. "The whole family's going to be there. I have some news I want to share." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Part of me hoped it might be something good, maybe even a step toward fixing things. My mom wasn't convinced. "Don't let your guard down," she warned. "You know how Diane is." When I arrived, it felt like walking into enemy territory. Diane greeted me with her usual fake smile, and Tyler and Ethan barely looked up from their phones. Dad seemed genuinely happy to see me, though, and I tried to focus on that. He ushered everyone into the dining room and started talking about how much he'd been reflecting on life lately. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," he said, "about how I want to take care of all of you when I'm gone." He went on to explain that he'd updated his will. Diane immediately perked up, her smile widening as she glanced at Tyler and Ethan. I could see the anticipation on her face, and for a split second, I wondered if I'd even been included at all. Dad started by saying he decided to leave the house to Diane. She clapped her hands together, looking like she just won the lottery. Then he said he'd set up a trust fund for Tyler and Ethan, giving them access to a sizable portion of his savings. Finally, he turned to me and said, "And I've left my retirement fund and the vintage car to you." I froze. The car was a big deal. It was a classic Mustang he'd spent years restoring. We used to work on it together when I was a kid, and it held a lot of sentimental value. I couldn't believe he was leaving it to me. Diane's face darkened the moment he said it. She glanced at Tyler and Ethan, and they both looked equally annoyed. "That's generous," Diane said through gritted teeth. Dad continued, explaining that he wanted everyone to feel secure. "You all mean the world to me," he said, looking around the table, but I could feel the tension rising, especially from Diane. When dinner was over, I headed to the guest room to grab my coat. On my way back, I overheard Diane talking to Tyler and Ethan in the kitchen. Her voice was low but angry. "Can you believe this?" she hissed. "He gave that car and all that money to him? After everything I've done for this family?" Tyler muttered something I couldn't hear, and Diane snapped back, "No, I'm not letting this happen. He doesn't deserve a dime. Trust me, I'll take care of it." My stomach dropped. I had no idea what she meant, but the venom in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever she had planned, it wasn't going to be good. I left that night feeling uneasy, my dad's kind gesture overshadowed by Diane's clear resentment. I told myself not to overthink it, but deep down, I knew she wasn't going to let it go. Diane had spent years pushing me out of the family. Now, with money and the car on the line, she had even more reason to make sure I disappeared for good. A few weeks after that dinner, I got a call from my dad. His voice was tense, almost guarded, as he told me Diane wanted to have a family meeting to resolve any misunderstandings. The word misunderstandings set off alarms in my head. I asked him why this couldn't just be a private conversation between us, but he insisted it would be good for everyone to clear the air. Against my better judgment, I agreed to come. Part of me hoped he might finally see what I'd been dealing with for years. When I arrived, the atmosphere was already charged. Diane greeted me with her usual overly sweet tone. Tyler and Ethan didn't even bother pretending to care, and my dad was uncharacteristically quiet. We sat down in the living room, and Diane wasted no time starting. "I think it's important to address the tension we all felt at dinner," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "I know Rob's decision about the will came as a surprise to some of us, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page." I stayed silent, but my hands clenched into fists. I knew this wasn't about clearing the air. This was about her setting the stage for whatever plan she had to undermine me. She turned to my dad and gave him this sad, pitiful look. "There's something I've been keeping to myself for a long time," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I can't stay silent anymore." My stomach dropped. I could already tell where this was going. She looked directly at me and said, "For years, I felt unsafe around you. There have been incidents, times when you made me feel uncomfortable. I never wanted to say anything because you were young, and I thought you'd grow out of it, but it's only gotten worse." I was too stunned to speak. Uncomfortable? What was she even talking about? She kept going, weaving this elaborate story about how I'd supposedly stared at her inappropriately, walked into rooms without knocking, and even tried to get too close to her when no one else was around. She claimed that during the family trip to California, I'd stood outside her bedroom door late at night, making her afraid to sleep. I could feel my chest tightening as she went on. None of it was true, but she was so calm, so convincing, that I could see the doubt starting to creep into my dad's eyes. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want to tear this family apart," she said, dabbing at fake tears with a tissue. "But now, with everything on the line, I can't keep quiet. I need to protect my boys. I need to protect myself." I finally found my voice. "That's a lie," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You're making this up because you don't want me to inherit anything." Diane gasped, looking wounded. "How dare you accuse me of lying?" she said. "After everything I've done for this family?" Tyler and Ethan immediately jumped in, yelling at me to stop disrespecting their mom. "You've always been a creep," Tyler said. "We've just been too nice to say it." I turned to my dad, desperate for him to see through the act. "Dad, you know me. You know I would never do anything like this." He looked conflicted, his eyes darting between me and Diane. "I don't know what to think," he said finally. "This is serious. If there's even a chance she's telling the truth." "She's not," I interrupted. "You've known me my whole life. How can you even consider believing her?" But Diane wasn't done. She leaned forward and said, "If you don't believe me, ask yourself why he's always avoided this house. Why he's been so distant. Maybe it's guilt." I was furious. "I avoided this house because of you," I shouted. "Because you've been treating me like garbage for years, and Dad's never done anything about it." The room exploded into chaos. Diane was crying, Tyler and Ethan were yelling, and my dad was trying to get everyone to calm down. Finally, he raised his voice and said, "That's enough. I can't deal with this right now. I think you should leave, at least until I figure out what's going on." It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. "You're kicking me out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just need time to think," he said, avoiding my eyes. "This is a lot to process." I stood there for a moment, numb. Then I grabbed my coat and walked out. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. I drove straight to my mom's house and told her everything. She was livid, pacing the room and swearing under her breath. "I knew she was manipulative," she said, "but this is a new low." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my dad's face, full of doubt, as he told me to leave. I couldn't believe he'd let her poison his mind like that. After everything we'd been through, after all the times I tried to tell him the truth about Diane, he still chose her over me. The next day, I blocked Diane, Tyler, and Ethan on everything. I didn't want to hear from them, but I couldn't bring myself to block my dad. Some part of me still hoped he'd call and tell me he believed me, that he'd kicked Diane out and things could go back to how they used to be. But that call never came. Weeks passed without a word from my dad. I tried to convince myself I didn't care, but the silence ate away at me. My mom kept checking in, asking how I was holding up, but I didn't have much to say. I spent most of my time at school or work, keeping myself busy to avoid thinking about what had happened. The truth was, I felt abandoned. Even though I knew Diane's lies were to blame, it hurt that my dad had believed her, or at least hadn't outright defended me. One evening, I was at home studying when an unknown number lit up my phone. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to answer. Against my better judgment, I picked up, and to my surprise, it was my dad. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from right now, but can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to hang up, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone flat. He sighed heavily. "I wanted to apologize. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now I've made some big mistakes. I should have believed you. I should have stood up for you. The words didn't hit me the way I thought they would. Instead of feeling relief or validation, I felt anger bubbling up. It took you long enough, I said bitterly. What changed? Did Diane finally admit she's been lying this whole time? There was a long pause on the other end. Not exactly, he said quietly, but she's gone. That got my attention. What do you mean, gone? She left, he explained. I found out she'd been cheating on me, with my best friend, of all people. When I confronted her, she didn't even deny it. She just packed up and left. Took Tyler and Ethan with her. I sat back, stunned. Diane had always been manipulative, but I never imagined she'd go that far. So what? Now that she's out of the picture, you suddenly care about what she did to me? I asked, my voice sharp. I've always cared, he said quickly. I didn't know what to do. She had this way of convincing me I was the one in the wrong. Every time you tried to tell me something was off, I let her talk me out of listening. And now I see how badly I screwed up. I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to speak without yelling, and a part of me wanted to hear him squirm. Look, he continued, I'm not asking for you to forgive me right away. I know I don't deserve that, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to make things right. I want to rebuild what we lost. I let out a bitter laugh. What we lost? You didn't lose anything. You threw it away when you chose her over me. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How it felt to be kicked out of your house because of her lies? And now you think you can just apologize and everything will be fine? He sounded like he was holding back tears. I don't expect everything to be fine, he said. I just want to try. Please. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he didn't deserve a second chance. But instead, I said, I need time to think. Then I hung up. For the next few days, I couldn't get the conversation out of my head. Part of me wanted to give him the chance to prove he was sorry, but another part of me was terrified he'd just hurt me again. My mom was firmly against the idea of reconciliation. He let her destroy your relationship for years, she said. Why should you trust him now? I didn't have an answer for her. I wasn't sure what I wanted. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore the call completely. No matter how angry I was, a small part of me still cared about him, still hoped he could be the dad I needed. Eventually, I texted him. I told him I wasn't ready to meet in person, but we could talk more over the phone. He agreed, and over the next few weeks, we had a handful of awkward, stilted conversations. He apologized again and again, and while I appreciated the effort, it didn't erase the years of neglect. One day, he mentioned something that caught me off guard. I've been thinking about reaching out to the rest of the family, he said, telling them the truth about what Diane did. I want to set the record straight. The idea sent a jolt through me. My extended family had believed Diane's lies for years, and many of them had cut ties with me because of it. The thought of them finally knowing the truth was tempting, but it also felt overwhelming. Why now? I asked. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. They deserve to know what really happened, and you deserve an apology. I wasn't sure if that was true. Even if they apologized, would it really change anything? Would it make up for all the damage that had been done? I didn't know the answer, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had some control over the situation. And for now, that was enough. After weeks of back-and-forth calls with my dad, he finally reached out to the rest of the family and told them the truth. He explained how Diane had manipulated him, how she'd fabricated the accusations against me, and how he had failed to protect me. I wasn't part of those conversations. I didn't want to be, but he kept me updated. Reactions were mixed. Some family members were horrified and apologized immediately. Others stayed quiet, probably embarrassed by how quick they'd been to judge me. A few, predictably, clung to Diane's version of events, refusing to believe she could have lied. I didn't care about the ones who doubted me. I'd spent too long trying to prove myself to people who didn't deserve it. The only apology I cared about was my dad's, and while it wasn't perfect, it was clear he was trying. Eventually, he asked to meet in person. I agreed, but only on the condition that it would be just the two of us. No Diane, no family drama, just him and me. We met at a small diner halfway between my place and his. When I walked in, he looked older, more tired than I remembered. He stood when he saw me, but I didn't offer a hug, and he seemed to understand. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice cautious. I nodded and sat down. "I'm here, but let's not pretend this fixes everything." He sighed. "I know, and I don't expect it to. I just want to be honest with you, for once." Over the next hour, he told me everything. How he'd ignored his gut instincts because it was easier to let Diane take control. How he'd convinced himself her lies were true because facing the alternative was too painful. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I didn't want to believe I'd married someone capable of doing something so cruel, so I took the easy way out. And in doing that, I failed you." Hearing him say it out loud stirred something in me. I wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time, I saw how much he regretted his choices. He wasn't asking for pity. He was taking responsibility. "I can't undo what I did," he said. "I can't give you back those years, or the trust one broke. All I can do is try to show you that I'm better now, and hope you'll give me the chance to prove it." I leaned back, staring at the table. The anger I'd carried for so long was still there, but it felt smaller, like it didn't define me anymore. "It's going to take time," I said finally. "If I decide to let you back in, it's going to be on my terms." "I'll take whatever you're willing to give me," he said, his voice steady. We didn't hug when we left the diner, but something between us shifted that day. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step forward. Months passed, and I started letting him back into my life little by little. We'd meet for coffee, exchange texts, talk about work and everyday things. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the old bitterness flared up, but I was learning to manage it. Therapy helped, as did the support of my mom and Sarah, who stood by me through everything. One afternoon, my dad surprised me by showing up at my apartment with something covered in a tarp. When he pulled it off, I saw the vintage Mustang, the car we'd worked on together when I was a kid. It looked exactly as I remembered, down to the last detail. "I thought you might want to take it for a spin," he said, handing me the keys. "It's yours now. I should have given it to you a long time ago." I didn't know what to say. The car had always been a symbol of the bond we'd shared before Diane came into the picture. Seeing it again felt like reclaiming a piece of my past. We drove for hours that day, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in years, I felt like I had my dad back. Not the man who'd failed me, but the one who'd been there before it all went wrong. I won't say everything is perfect now. There are still wounds that haven't fully healed, and maybe they never will. But I've learned that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means finding a way to live with it and choosing not to let it define you. For years, I thought Diane had taken everything from me. My family, my confidence, my sense of belonging. But sitting in that car, with the engine humming beneath me and my dad laughing at some stupid joke I made, I realized she hadn't won. She tried to tear me down, but I was still here. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.